Alleluia, 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 Alleluia. God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, and entrusting to us the message of salvation. Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. 2 people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself: "O God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes on my whole income." But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Trying to understand the equivalencies of the social roles and figures between the time of the Gospels and our own is difficult, in part because the roles have almost completely switched in many respects. The tax collector of our own time, whom we might consider to be somebody who's sort of a nuisance, maybe an IRS worker or maybe even an accountant or somebody like this, a government official of some kind, is sort of a respectable kind of guy, even if you don't necessarily want to get on his bad side, right? This sort of person is the person who, just basically keeps their nose down, does their work, applies the rules equally, and even if sometimes that does not work out in our own favor, it probably doesn't work out in other people's favor as well, and everybody is just kind of, everybody is not very happy to be the object of government attention, whatever that might be. The Pharisee, on the other hand, seems to resemble for us a clerical figure, right? And especially a clerical figure who, in our own time, does not practice what he preaches at all, right? The clerical figure who seems to betray his religion and religious practice far more than propagates it. And this figure is somebody who, of course, is justly and rightly upbraided by Jesus and caught in their schemes at every turn. But this is to miss something of the surprise of the gospel in its own context, in its own time. The tax collector, in fact, was a government official, so to speak, but a government official who was appointed by a very corrupt government. Right, a government official who probably resembled somebody more like a member of the mafia than an actual formally deputed person. Right, somebody who in fact had all of the power and really none of the authority. Certainly none of the authority that was accorded by the Jewish law, which was really both the social as well as the religious glue that held together the community of Israel. This person was in fact deputed by an oppressive government, an oppressive alien government, foreign government. And this person not only did not have the authorization to collect the taxes legitimately, but in fact would often apply these rules and would take advantage of this power unfairly, and would often use it to the disadvantage of the poor, or the disadvantage of those who were not able in some other way to find defenses for themselves. This is the true picture of the tax collector. As I say, something like a member of the mafia, or maybe even as well in certain communities, a drug dealer. Somebody who in fact has much power, but wields it wrongly and does not have the authorization, the true authorization to carry out this role that he tries to prop up for himself. Most especially the tax collector who, in some sense, attempted to practice religion, or to show his practice of religion, would be even more contemptible as somebody who practiced one thing and proclaimed another by his outward appearance, who seemed to, in fact, to pray and to sort of do certain works of piety, perhaps certain convenient works of piety, but on the other hand was somebody who was, in fact, a parasite on the community. And this is the true picture of the tax collector in his own time. The Pharisee, by comparison, or even not by comparison, but just in himself, is actually a very respectable figure. Jesus seems to be very strange, in fact, in his own time for calling out this very respectable person. The Pharisee was not held in contempt by the average person. The Pharisee was not somebody who went around necessarily vocally casting scorn or aspersions upon people who were not Pharisees themselves. The Pharisees, it seems, just more or less kept to themselves, and their pride was such that they did not even need to put other people down in order to elevate themselves. They already felt quite elevated by and of themselves. The Pharisee was somebody, if anything, that other people looked up to. They perhaps had certain opportunities, or at the very least, they practiced the sorts of things that everybody wished to practice, which was this sort of perfect application of the divine law, of Jewish Torah. They were a respectable person who, even if they were not somebody who had the imitation of everybody else. The very name Pharisee means the separate ones. Nonetheless, they were held in esteem as those who practiced what they preached. They held a certain standard of religion, and they held themselves to it as well. Although Jesus will frequently throughout the Gospels refer to them as hypocrites, he does not refer to them as hypocrites for their stringent practice of the law. In many cases, they do very stringently practice the law. It is for their inconsistent idea of what the law is about, as well as then that consequent effect on their practice of the Jewish law, which Jesus himself arrives as the authentic interpreter of. We must understand this, brothers and sisters, if we are to understand this gospel as well as so many other gospels in our canon of scriptures. If we are to understand that the Pharisee cannot so easily be dismissed as simply a hypocritical clerical guy who doesn't deserve his position and doesn't deserve his praise, and in fact who is praised by no one. In fact, the Pharisee is someone who is held in respect by the average common person, right? Someone who is in a certain sense above reproach. But Jesus, in holding them up to the critical light that they, perhaps unbeknownst to others, hold others to, shows them that in fact their righteousness, or the source of their righteousness, is mistaken. And it is mistaken for the reasons that Jesus points out today. It is mistaken for what might be considered a very small reason. It is mistaken because the very thing that undermines their righteousness, or what they consider the source of their righteousness, is what we all consider to be something that everyone suffers from: pride. The pride of the Pharisee. The pride of the Pharisee is not simply thinking himself something great, but in fact thinking himself something higher than in fact he is, greater than in fact he is. And this thinking of oneself, this exalting oneself beyond one's actual state or status, is the sin of our first parents, and for this reason is so pervasive in every person, in all of human nature. Because it was the choice of our first parents to, so to speak, grasp after divinity without receiving it from him as a gift. It was the presumption of our first parents that they could choose to be like God by their own selves, that they could choose, in fact, to attain divinity simply by willing it, simply by practicing it, simply by assuming it to themselves, and that in so doing they would attain what in fact was the goal that God had placed in their minds, the dream that God had placed in their hearts, which was, in fact, to attain this divinity, but not by themselves, but rather by his own divine gift. This, brothers and sisters, is the mistake of the Pharisee. And unfortunately, it is not only a tragic mistake, but it is also a moral mistake. These Pharisees, who in fact had the study of the law, who took so carefully their practice of religion, Jesus seems to point out again and again, should have known better. They should have in fact recognized throughout the Scriptures the praise that God lavishes on the humble, on the lowly, the way that in fact each and every person is called not simply to the greatness of God, but to attain this greatness through humility, to attain this greatness in fact through the recognition of the corruption of our nature, as well as our own tendency to rebel against God and his will. It is this lesson which is learned again and again in the Old Testament, in what would in New Testament times have been called simply the Scriptures. It was this lesson that was again and again hashed out for God's people, which some in the providence of God came to learn and to practice and to demonstrate for others. But it is the Pharisees who, in a certain sense, were the practicing or the more practicing Jews of their own day, should have recognized this, but did not. They were not members of the clergy. They were simply those who strove for a certain level, we may say, or a certain adequate level of the practice of their faith, who found this practice of the certain level of their faith enough that they were able to compare themselves favorably to others and therefore compare themselves favorably to God himself. It is for this reason that Jesus says that the Pharisee does not go home justified, because he does not recognize even the source of the goodness of the works that he does, which are themselves truly good, but which he attributes to his own goodness rather than to the goodness of God himself. In this sense, it is more justified, or the tax collector himself is more just in recognizing that he is the source of his own wickedness. He is the source of his own need for the mercy of God. He does not make the mistake that the Pharisee does of seeing the source of goodness and badness wrongly. He in fact sees God as the source of goodness and the source of mercy, and he himself as the source of his need for mercy and of his wickedness. And in so doing, he himself is on the right track. It is this being on the right track, brothers and sisters, that makes one go home either justified or unjustified from prayer. And we ourselves are called by prayer. God desires that we, in the use of our freedom, by asking for, by seeking out, in response to his grace, in response to his offer, his call, that we ourselves by prayer should in fact become justified. We in fact should merit what he promises, as the prayer says in our opening prayer today. God desires that this merit, however, should not be of ourselves, but should be through the humble reception of what he gives to us, and that we then, cooperatively with him, make use of. Today, brothers and sisters, the Lord is calling us to examine the ways in which we find ourselves operating in the manner of the Pharisee, of comparing ourselves favorably with other people, and so in the meantime undermining the real value of our prayer, since we make our prayer simply a time in which to prop ourselves up, to preen and to show ourselves off to God. And when we can't do this, we simply don't talk to God at all. Instead, we should recognize the need that, in fact, those times when we do not feel comfortable kneeling before God, when we do not feel comfortable appearing before God, because we have nothing to offer to him, because we have nothing to impress him, that in fact that is the prayer that justifies. That is the prayer that God desires. That is the prayer, in fact, brothers and sisters, that God gives us the gift of prayer for. We can never be anything but beggars in prayer before God for his mercy. And so today we come once again begging in this Eucharistic liturgy, the greatest of all prayers, that God will give us that which we could never deserve of ourselves, and we would never even have dreamed to ask for, that he would give us his very self in his body, blood, soul, and divinity. And he gives this to us through our faith, through our knowledge of what to ask for, that in asking for God to give us himself, he answers, and he answers in a way that truly feeds us, that nourishes us in body, mind, and spirit.